Thank you, Mohill. First of all, I want to welcome the report and congratulate the Justice Committee on the work that it's been doing. The issue of community policing and rural crime is something that I know affects practically every constituency and county in the country, but particularly coming from a very rural constituency of Sligo Leitrim, we're all very conscious of the, I suppose, the fear very often that exists in rural isolated communities, particularly in regard to crime against older people or farm theft and all of that. And sometimes, we can quote statistics and say that they're at a very low level, and they may well be. However, that doesn't remove the sense of fear and trepidation that exists, particularly with older people who feel very isolated, with the knowledge that the local Garda station in their local town is no longer there, that they don't see the Gardaí as often as they used. Certainly, I know people tell me that 20, 30 years ago, when they drove through rural Ireland, they would very often be stopped at a checkpoint because they'd have a bald tyre or something. They very seldom see that happen now, and while it may have been a problem then, they wish they'd seen it more often, that there were more Gardaí out doing that sort of thing, that they would be seen and be more a part of the community, if you like. But one of the key things I certainly believe, and I see it unfortunately very recently in my own area, is that in many small rural towns particularly, we have small groups of individuals, some of them from outside the area, and Mohill is an example. In the last number of weeks in the small town of Mohill in County Leitrim, we've had a lot of intimidation, and we've had people who've had shots fired at houses, we've had petrol bombs thrown at houses, and this has been done by a small number of people who we understand are involved in the drugs trade to some extent. And the victims of this are innocent people in the community who have nothing got to do with anything. And it is purely bringing a great sense of anger and resentment among people in many rural towns, that they see people doing this and threatening and intimidating people who they know have a long list of convictions behind them, and yet they seem to be able to carry on in this manner with little or no impact from An Garda Síochána, who I know and understand are doing their best in the circumstances they're in. But when this is continuous to happen, and that's just one example in Mohill, it's happening in many other towns around the country as well. It has been mentioned earlier how the Armed Response Unit is in Longford at the moment. Again, this is part of a trend that we see, that what was crime that unfortunately was mainly visited here in our capital city has become more commonplace in many rural towns around the country. And really, we need resources to ensure that that is brought to an end, and we need a renewed focus, I think, on focusing in on where the source of these criminals are, because very often they are the same criminals and the same groups of people who are engaged in the rural crime that are exploiting older people, etc. I also want to welcome the part of the report that mentions about the restorative justice measures and particularly the youth diversion programme. And the youth diversion programme and interceding at an early stage when young people may, through whatever reason, get into bad company, etc., is certainly something that needs to be given greater focus. That said, I have come across issues of where the youth diversion programme has been inappropriately used, in my view, particularly in issues where there was sexual crime involved. And I don't think it's appropriate in that situation. I think that needs to be revised and looked at, because in some situations it is not the correct route to go down. The issue in regard to mental health issues has also been mentioned, and I suppose social issues and issues of mental health and all of these things are often part of a problem that we have in many of our rural communities around poverty and around a sense of hopelessness and around a sense that we are not given the opportunity that they may have in other places. And they are wider social issues which have an impact. And particularly the drugs crime, I suppose, is one of the ones that's the typical example, that in general we see issues which are around drugs crime are mainly happening in more deprived communities. And they are about building a greater social network to ensure that people don't fall into that trap, don't fall into that way of life, and build better resources and build our better capacity in our rural communities and in our small rural towns to be able to defend against that. The issue of Garda numbers is always going to be raised, and we understand that, and I have some sympathy with the Minister that we know we can't always have the number of Gardaí that we need on the day we need them in the place we need them. And that's understandable, and Deputy Adams spoke earlier of particularly issues that are in County Louth, and we all have understand that Gardaí can't be everywhere all the time. But that said, there is a great difficulty that in many, many cases people can't get a Garda when they look for them, that they do feel that their experience is that there is an under-resourced issue there. And I think greater efforts need to be made, particularly in areas where we know there are particular elements which are engaged in dangerous crime, and that needs to be brought to a renewed focus. Another area that I think needs renewed focus, and it's unfortunately a bit like the drug situation, it's in every rural, well, not every, but quite a number of rural towns, is the crimes of exploitation, particularly sexual exploitation and brothels, which are jumping up all over the place in many rural towns. And it's an issue that needs to be dealt with, and isn't been dealt with. And there are young women who are, a lot of them are trafficked, and they are being exploited. And I think it needs to be addressed urgently, because it does have a knock-on effect. And it's certainly a culture that I don't think, it's a culture which has been in some parts of Europe, and it's a culture that I don't think we need to see come into this country. And while it is certainly a legal activity, the experience to date is that it seems to be an activity that is not getting the kind of attention that it deserves to get. So, Minister, I'd ask you, it's something that really needs to get attention, because it does have a spin-off into other crime and to other dangerous activity, but particularly for the young women that are being abused and exploited in that way, it is absolutely wrong and deplorable that that is continuing to happen. And I think the Gardaí need to be given whatever resources are required to stamp that out everywhere it's happening.